But Diane wasn't the same woman who had walked on eggshells around his moods for the past year. She had spent the afternoon reading about divorce lawyers and looking at apartments she could afford on her teacher's salary. She had called her best friend and asked if she could stay there for a few days while she figured things out. She had already started the process of untangling her life from Eric's. "I want you to leave," she repeated, her voice firm and unwavering. "I want you to pack a bag and leave right now." Eric stared at her for a long moment, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Maybe he was. Maybe he had gotten so used to the quiet, submissive woman he had married that he had forgotten the strong, independent woman he had fallen in love with. Or maybe he had never really known her at all. He packed a bag in silence, throwing clothes into a suitcase with angry, jerky movements. Before he left, he turned to Diane one last time. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You'll never find anyone who loves you like I do." Diane looked at him standing there in their doorway, this man who had promised to cherish her and instead had treated her like she was invisible. "I hope you're right," she said quietly. "Because if this is what your love looks like, I don't want it." The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Diane's life. She moved in with her friend Jessica, sleeping on a couch in a one-bedroom apartment and trying to rebuild her life from scratch. The divorce process was messy and painful. Eric fought her on every single point, from the division of their small savings account to who would keep the wedding gifts. He seemed determined to make the separation as difficult as possible, as if punishing her for having the audacity to leave. But the worst part wasn't the legal battles or the financial stress. It was the way Eric's family treated her. His mother, who had once welcomed Diane with open arms, now acted like she was a stranger. His sister, who had asked Diane to be her maid of honor just months before, refused to speak to her at all. They made it clear that in their eyes, Diane was the one who had destroyed the marriage by refusing to work things out. The confrontation with Eric's family came on a rainy Saturday morning when Diane went to their house to collect the last of her belongings. She had arranged to come while Eric was at work, but his mother and sister were there waiting for her. The moment Diane walked through the door, they attacked. "You're destroying my son's life," Eric's mother said, her voice cold and accusatory. "He's a good man, and you're throwing away your marriage because you're too selfish to work on your problems." Eric's sister joined in, her voice shrill and angry. "You're going to regret this, Diane. You're not getting any younger, and no decent man is going to want someone who's been divorced. You're making the biggest mistake of your life." For a moment, Diane felt like she was back in that kitchen, listening to Eric dismiss her feelings and blame her for his actions. But then she remembered the woman she had been before marriage, the woman who had values and boundaries and self-respect. She looked at these women who were supposed to be her family, and she realized that their approval was not worth sacrificing her happiness. "You're right," Diane said quietly, her voice steady despite the hurt she was feeling. "I am destroying Eric's life. I'm destroying the life where he gets to treat me like I'm invisible while he cheats on me with his coworker. I'm destroying the life where I'm supposed to be grateful for scraps of affection and pretend I don't notice when he comes home smelling like another woman's perfume." Eric's mother and sister stared at her in shock. Clearly, Eric had not shared the full story of why his marriage had ended. He had painted himself as the victim of an unreasonable wife, conveniently leaving out the part about his affair and emotional abandonment. "You don't know what you're talking about," his mother said, but her voice was less certain now. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Diane replied. "I know that your son is a cheater and a liar, and I know that you raised him to think that women are supposed to accept whatever scraps of affection men choose to give them. But I'm not your son's mother, and I'm not his maid, and I'm not his emotional punching bag. I'm his wife, or I was, and I deserve better than what he gave me." She packed her remaining belongings in silence, while Eric's family watched from the doorway. When she was finished, she turned to them one last time. "I hope Eric finds someone who's willing to accept the kind of love he's capable of giving," she said. "But it's not going to be me." Walking out of that house, Diane felt like she was leaving more than just her marriage behind. She was leaving behind the version of herself who had believed that love meant accepting less than she deserved, who had thought that being a good wife meant making herself smaller so her husband could feel bigger. She was leaving behind the woman who had been so afraid of being alone that she had stayed in a relationship that was slowly killing her spirit. The months that followed were a mixture of freedom and terror. Diane found a small apartment across town, a one-bedroom place with thin walls and a kitchen that was barely bigger than a closet. But it was hers. She could decorate it however she wanted, eat whatever she wanted for dinner, watch whatever she wanted on television. She could be herself without having to worry about Eric's moods or needs or opinion. The loneliness was real, though. There were evenings when Diane would come home from work to her empty apartment and feel the weight of silence pressing down on her. She would think about Eric, wonder if he was still with Sarah, wonder if he was happy. Sometimes she would find herself questioning whether she had made the right choice. Maybe she should have tried harder to save their marriage. Maybe she should have been more patient with Eric's flaws. But then she would remember the woman she had been during those final months of marriage, the woman who had apologized for things that weren't her fault and begged for attention from a man who had already given his heart to someone else. She would remember how small and invisible she had felt, how she had lost herself trying to hold on to a relationship that was already gone. Slowly, Diane began to rebuild her life. She started reading again, something she had given up during her marriage because Eric had always made her feel like her interests were boring or childish. She joined a book club at the local library, making friends with other women who loved literature and discussion. She started taking cooking classes, not to become a better wife, but because she enjoyed experimenting with new flavors and techniques. For the first time in years, Diane remembered what it felt like to be excited about her own life. She started planning weekend trips to nearby cities, exploring museums and cafes and bookstores on her own. She bought herself flowers just because she liked them, not because it was a special occasion. She learned to enjoy her own company, to find peace in solitude rather than seeing it as something to be afraid of. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in March. Diane sat in the courthouse, wearing a navy blue dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, watching the judge sign the papers that would officially end her marriage. Eric was there too, sitting across the room with his lawyer, but he didn't look at her once during the entire proceeding. When it was over, Diane walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than she had in years. That evening, she called her mother to share the news. "I'm proud of you," her mother said, her voice warm and supportive. "I know it wasn't easy, but you did what you had to do. You chose yourself, and that takes courage." Diane cried that night, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope for the future. She had survived the worst period of her life and come out stronger on the other side. She had learned that she could take care of herself, that she could be alone without being lonely, that she could trust her own judgment even when everyone else was telling her she was wrong. 6 months after the divorce, Diane got a phone call that changed everything. It was Eric, and he was crying. She hadn't heard from him since the day he had packed his bags and left their home, and hearing his voice on the phone brought back a flood of memories and emotions she thought she had processed. "Diane," he said, his voice thick with tears, "I need to talk to you. I need to tell you something." Her first instinct was to hang up the phone. She had worked so hard to build a life without Eric, to find peace and happiness on her own. She didn't want to be pulled back into his chaos, his drama, his need for attention and validation. But something in his voice made her pause. "What is it, Eric?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Sarah left me," he said, and Diane could hear him trying to control his sobs. "She said I was emotionally unavailable, that I didn't know how to love someone properly. She said I was selfish and immature, and that she couldn't build a life with someone who didn't know how to put another person's needs before his own." Diane felt a strange mix of emotions listening to Eric's pain. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated, to say that Sarah had figured out what it had taken Diane years to understand. But mostly, she just felt sad for him. Sad that he had lost 2 relationships because he didn't know how to be a partner, sad that he was only now realizing what he had thrown away. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and she meant it. "But I'm not sure why you're calling me." "Because I realized something," Eric said, his voice becoming more desperate. "I realized that you were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw it away because I was too stupid and selfish to appreciate what I had. I want to fix things, Diane. I want to make it right." Diane closed her eyes and leaned back against her couch. A year ago, hearing these words would have been like a dream come true. She had wanted so badly for Eric to recognize her worth, to fight for their marriage, to choose her over his career and his ego and his other women. But now, Sitting in her peaceful apartment surrounded by the life she had built for herself, she realized that his validation no longer mattered to her. "Eric," she said gently, "you can't fix something that was never really whole to begin with. We weren't good for each other. We brought out the worst in each other instead of the best." "But I'm different now," Eric insisted. "I'm seeing a therapist. I'm working on myself. I understand what I did wrong, and I want to make it up to you." Diane was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the woman she had been during their marriage, the woman who had begged for scraps of affection and made excuses for Eric's behavior. That woman would have jumped at the chance to take Eric back, would have seen his pain as proof that he finally understood how much he had hurt her. But the woman, she was now understood something that the old Diane hadn't. Love wasn't about being chosen after someone had exhausted all their other options. Love wasn't about being someone's safety net or their consolation prize. Real love was about being valued and respected and cherished from the beginning, not after months of therapy and heartbreak had forced someone to realize what they had lost. "I'm glad you're working on yourself," Diane said finally. "I really am. But I'm not the same person I was when we were married, and I don't think going backward is the answer for either of us." Eric was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was small and broken. "I love you, Diane. I know I didn't show it when it mattered, but I love you." "I know you do," Diane said, and she realized that she believed him. "But love isn't enough, Eric. Love without respect, without partnership, without emotional intimacy, it's just not enough. And I deserve more than that." They talked for another hour, and something strange happened during that conversation. For the first time in their entire relationship, Eric really listened to her. He didn't interrupt or dismiss her feelings or try to argue with her perspective. He just listened, and when she was finished talking, he thanked her for being honest with him. "I understand why you can't take me back," he said. "I hate it, but I understand it. I just want you to know that losing you was the biggest mistake of my life, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure I never treat another person the way I treated you." After they hung up, Diane sat in her apartment feeling a strange sense of closure. She had spent so many months angry at Eric, angry at his family, angry at the whole situation. But now, hearing the genuine pain in his voice and the real remorse in his words, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel: forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness that meant she was willing to give him another chance, but the kind that meant she was finally ready to let go of the anger and resentment that had been weighing her down. Eric had been a flawed husband, but he wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had made terrible choices and was now living with the consequences. Over the next few months, Eric continued to work on himself. He stayed in therapy, he read books about relationships and emotional intelligence, he started volunteering at a local charity. He didn't contact Diane again, respecting her boundaries and her decision to move on. But through mutual friends, she heard about his progress, his genuine efforts to become a better person. And slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Diane started to remember the good times from their relationship, the moments when Eric had been kind and funny and thoughtful. She started to see him as a complete person rather than just the villain in her story. She began to understand that their marriage had failed not because either of them was fundamentally bad, but because they had both been too young and too immature to handle the challenges of building a life together. A year and a half after their divorce, Diane ran into Eric at a coffee shop. It was the same coffee shop where they had first met, and seeing him there brought back a rush of memories. He looked different somehow, older maybe, but also more peaceful. When he saw her, he smiled hesitantly and asked if he could buy her a coffee. They sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and for the first time in years, they had a real conversation. Eric told her about his therapy, about the things he had learned about himself and about relationships. He talked about how he had finally understood that his behavior during their marriage had been about his own fears and insecurities, not about anything Diane had done wrong. "I used to think that love meant never having to change," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "I thought that if someone really loved me, they would accept me exactly as I was, flaws and all. But I realize now that real love is about growing together, about becoming better people, because you want to be worthy of each other." Diane listened to him talk, and she could see that he really had changed. The defensive, angry man she had divorced was gone, replaced by someone who could take responsibility for his actions and acknowledge his mistakes without making excuses. It was the conversation she had wished they could have had during their marriage, but she knew that Eric hadn't been ready for it then. "I'm proud of you," she said, and she meant it. "It takes courage to look at yourself honestly and make real changes." "I had to," Eric said simply. "I couldn't keep living the way I was living, hurting people I cared about, and then wondering why I was so unhappy. I had to learn how to be a better person, not just for you or for Sarah, but for myself." They talked for 2 hours, and when they